Chances are, if you're watching this video, you've just recently found out about Warhammer 40k, a super bombastic and over-the-top science fiction franchise. But for how cool Warhammer is, it's really difficult for new people to actually get into it. The tabletop game is very expensive, there's around 600 novels with no clear book one, there's dozens of video games, but most of them are really hit or miss. So how does somebody get started with Warhammer? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this video. I'm going to tell you which books are worth reading, which ones are good for a first timer, what video games are worth playing, and whether or not you could actually get into the tabletop and build an army. So stay tuned. So I think it's important at the start of this video to really establish what Warhammer actually is. At its core, Warhammer 40k is a dark science fiction franchise that got started in the 80s. It started as a spin-off of another franchise known as Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and in the early days you could really think of it as fantasy in space. You had all the trappings, you had space orcs and space elves, space dwarfs, things like that, just in a more futuristic setting. There were even a lot of characters and entities that were directly pulled from that first universe and placed in this new one. As time progressed and his story became more and more fleshed out, it ended up as a counterculture version and a direct parody of a lot of science fiction that was popular at the time. It became basically a really dark version of Star Wars, complete with good and evil space wizards. It also ran counter to hopeful science fiction like Star Trek, which at its very core had a very hopeful message about the future. Diplomacy works and peace was the top priority, and no matter what the problem was, we could overcome it together. Warhammer 40k was not like that at all. It had a much more bleak message about the future. The tagline for Warhammer is, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war," which is pretty much the exact opposite of Star Trek. Now, the game would go through multiple renditions over the years and would slowly begin expanding into other forms of media like novels, spin-off games, video games, comics, you name it. And today in 2022, we're actually in the 9th edition of the tabletop game, and there's something like 600 novels published. It's a super dark and violent universe where mankind is under constant threat of aliens and demons and has had to switch gears from progress to survival. You have factions like the Space Marines, bioengineered super warriors that fight to protect mankind, as well as their counterparts, the Chaos Marines, that want to see the Imperium of Man burn. The Adeptus Mechanicus, techno-cultists that literally worship machines and pray to them to keep them functioning, that say things like the flesh is weak. The Ancient and Dying Necrons, who consider themselves the rightful rulers of the galaxy and will stop at nothing to take it back. Or the vile Tyrannid Swarm, the infinite hunger that seeks to consume every living thing in the galaxy. These factions and many more are locked in a never-ending conflict, as there is no peace amongst the stars, only the laughter of thirsting gods. And when I say this universe is big, I mean it is ridiculously big, not just in terms of the actual universe itself, but in the real world and how much media it covers. There are dozens of video games. Like I mentioned before, there's around 600 novels at this point, and we seem to be getting 1 or 2 new ones every single month from Games Workshop. In addition to that, Marvel is now putting out a line of Warhammer comic books. They have their own streaming service with 2 animated shows so far, but hopefully we're going to get a lot more content in the future. And Warhammer is also seeing kind of a little bit of a resurgence, especially in its mainstream popularity when you have celebrities like Henry Cavill going on late nights talking about how he loves painting his Custodes army. Now, this year alone, we've already seen 3 major AAA games announced in the Warhammer universe. We have Space Marine 2 coming later this year, we have Darktide, and we have a remake of the Chaos Gate game. And I think those games are going to represent an awesome opportunity for new people to get into Warhammer, because this is an amazing franchise with an even more amazing community attached to it. And I won't go on any longer about this because honest to God, we could be here all day. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this. So now that we've spoken about what Warhammer actually is, let's talk about the tabletop game. So to me, it makes sense talking about the tabletop game first because that's what Warhammer is most known for. It's what is known as a tabletop war game. And if you're unfamiliar with this genre of game, it basically means that you pick from one of 20 different factions, and we're not going to get into sub-factions because there's a whole lot of them. But you pick a faction that resonates with you, and then you build and paint your own army. And here's the thing, all of the models that you end up using in this are actual kits that you build yourself. And it's a lot different than normal hobby model building or things like Gunpla because there's actually a game associated with it as well. Don't get me wrong, I think the Gunpla models are super cool, but once you're done building it or painting it, you just put it on a shelf. And I mean, that's cool and all, they look awesome, but I like it so much more that there's actually a game associated with them. I want to play with my toys after I build them. But maybe you're a person that comes from D&D or other role-playing games like that, And one of the major differences here is instead of controlling a single character, you're controlling an entire army. And you don't just have to play this game competitively. You don't always have to be a sweaty tryhard. There's actually rules in the core book for a system called Crusade, which is pretty much a narrative-based game, where your characters and units end up leveling up over time and you tell a story of how your army came together. So there's actually a lot of different ways that you can play the tabletop game. And what's really cool about this is you end up getting to customize your own army. There's a lot of people that like to paint them how they look on the box or paint them based on something that they've found in the lore, but many other people like to paint them in completely random colors, something that is completely unique to them. It's unlike anything I've ever really experienced before. You feel a real ownership over your army. Maybe you'll end up playing the super silly orcs or a legion of space marines, or maybe you want something a little darker and you end up going with chaos demons. No matter who you are, you'll end up finding an army that really resonates with you. And then you actually get to play the game. And the way Warhammer works is it's basically a point buy system where you and your opponent agree on how many points you want to play, and that will determine the size of your game. And then every single unit in the game, from the standard run-of-your-mill basic troop to a giant 40-foot tall robot, all have a different point value. And by having points associated with every single model, no matter what you decide to play, you can keep the game fair. Maybe your ideal army is just running 4 models, just 4 super big giant robots, or maybe instead you'd rather have 300 guardsmen. Regardless of how you decide to customize your army, eventually you and your opponent will play against each other on the tabletop. You'll normally set up a bunch of terrain like broken bunkers or barricades to hide behind, and then you move your troops around on the field and fire guns and charge into melee combat and basically try to kill each other and accomplish certain objectives. And it is an enormous amount of fun. All of the armies play sort of similar in that if you understand how to play one army, you can jump to another one really easily, but they're different enough and have their own unique rules to make every army feel special. Now, here's the thing. Warhammer the game can be very expensive. On average, if you're looking to pay retail price for an army, it can cost anywhere from $500 to $2,000. Now, that's if you're planning on playing around 2,000 points. For people who are brand new to this, you don't have to play an army that big. That's just what everybody tends to gravitate towards because they have all these models and they've been collecting them for years. So what I recommend you do if you do want to play the tabletop is to get yourself a combat patrol box or one of the split boxes. A combat patrol retails for around $140, and there's one for pretty much every army. There's a couple of armies that still haven't had a combat patrol released for them, but they have what is known as a start collecting box, which is actually a little bit cheaper but has a few less models in it. In game, each of these combat patrols comes in around 500 points. So if you and a friend both want to start playing and you both buy a combat patrol, they should be able to fight each other no problem without it being unfair. Now, Games Workshop also makes these things that the community likes to refer to as either a split box or a versus box. These boxes are basically 2-player starter sets that come with 2 different factions in the same box, and they normally come at a pretty steep discount compared to buying all of these models individually. Now, these box sets normally retail for around $200, which compared to buying 2 combat patrols at $280, it's normally actually a better deal. Now, the other option is to buy your army used, and this is a way to save a lot of money. I mean, you can go on eBay and find people selling their old Warhammer stuff all the time. A lot of competitive players will actually sell off an army as soon as it's not performing super well to buy whatever the new hotness is. So if you don't care about being the literal best player and traveling the country and going to all kinds of tournaments and stuff, then this is a really good way of saving some money. Now, the major piece of advice I would give you if you're looking to start your very first Warhammer army is to pick an army that resonates with you that you really like. Here's the thing. If you buy an army based on how well it's performing in the tournament scene, those rules tend to change all the time. New codexes come out, new hotfixes come out, so something that's overpowered right now, tomorrow it might be absolutely awful, and the things that were awful might be really, really good. So you want to pick an army that you like, because honestly, if you're going to be painting these miniatures and you're painting something that you're just not interested in, you're going to hate it. So if this all sounds good to you and you would really like to play the tabletop game, but even still with those split boxes and used models it's just too expensive, I totally understand that. You should check out a game called Kill Team. It's basically a smaller version of 40k that uses a handful of models rather than an entire army. So where a 40k army can have anywhere from 30 to like 300 models, Kill Team uses about 10. And instead of moving entire units around the board, you're moving individual models. Each guy is their own squad. And you can get into Kill Team for way cheaper than 40k because you're not having to buy an entire army. But the best part about it is those models are fully usable in the full 40k game. So if you do decide that that's something you want to do in the future, you can use those models that you already got for Kill Team. For me personally, the lore of what Warhammer is what makes it truly special, and it's the thing I care about the most. So let's talk about some books. What's a good one to start with? So I understand how difficult it is to get into actually reading these books. As soon as you see that there's like 600 of them, that turns a lot of people off. And I totally get that. I understand that. I'm going to walk you through it. So here's the thing. Most of those books aren't in any kind of order. Now, if you look at the entire catalog, you're going to see a whole bunch of trilogies. You'll see the Horus Heresy, which has about 60 books in its line. The Horus Heresy has a bunch of different arcs, but most of the books aren't in any real order, and a lot of them are one-offs. So the good news is you can jump in literally anywhere, and what I always tell people is to pick a book that's based on a character or faction that they find interesting. If you're somebody who got into this universe because of one of my shorts, or you were watching me over on TikTok, was there one that particularly resonated with you? Because whatever that one was, maybe that's what you should read about. Maybe you couldn't care less about Space Marines, but the orcs just sound absolutely hilarious. Well, then there's a book for you. It's called Brutal Cunning. And it's a book written completely from the orcs' perspective. And yes, it's just as hilarious as you think it is. Or maybe you really are into Space Marines, but in particular, you really like Space Wolves. Well, pick up the Space Wolf Omnibus. It features 3 different books in one that are all about the Space Wolves. So in the interest of making this video not 2.5 hours long, I'm not gonna go ahead and list a book for every single faction and every single main character, because that would take a really long time. But I will say that most of the really important characters in this book do at least have one book based on them, as well as pretty much every major faction. For me right now, I'm really interested in the Necron, so I'm reading The Twice Dead King. I actually just finished the first book last night, and I've just started on the second one. And I can definitely say if you're somebody that's interested in the Necrons, then this is for sure the book for you. Now, people often ask me what the book series I started with was, and that was the Night Lord trilogy. I was really into Chaos Space Marines, and it sounded like a perfect introduction for me. Now, here's the thing. If you're not into Chaos Space Marines and you don't particularly like reading books about the bad guys, you are really not going to enjoy the Night Lord trilogy. It is dark. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, if you really like the super dark, edgy stuff, then check it out. Otherwise, I'd avoid it. But maybe you like a whole bunch of things in Warhammer and you really can't pick where you'd want to start, then I have a couple of recommendations for you. The first book I would recommend is Caiaphas Cain, Hero of the Imperium. It's a smaller story in scale and you really don't need to know too much about the universe to get into it. It's also a little bit more lighthearted, which is definitely a rarity when it comes to 40k books. It stars the titular Caiaphas Cain, who is a commissar. And if you don't know what a commissar is, just real quickly, briefly, they're basically a higher ranking officer that is in charge of keeping morale up. Now, the human soldiers in this universe have to go up against some pretty horrific enemies, so their job is to be basically a charismatic presence that keeps them fighting. They're also authorized to do this by any means necessary, so, sometimes it can get a little grimdark. Regardless, Caiaphas Cain is a commissar whose only dream is to work a cushy desk job away from danger. The problem is, he prioritizes his own safety. So what ends up happening is in the middle of a fight when things are going really bad, he'll end up hiding behind a barricade or in a barrel or something like that. And then he ends up as the lone survivor. So when he comes back, everybody thinks he's some great hero because he was the only one to survive. And the Imperium basically looks at it as a waste of his potential and his clearly immense power to put him in a cushy desk job, so they keep promoting him to even more dangerous situations. It's a wonderful book, and Cain is a super engaging character. He's charismatic, he's funny, and despite what I said before, he's highly trained and incredibly brave. Well, brave when he needs to be. And if you end up liking it, there's a whole series of Cain books. Now, if you want something a bit more punchy that's more current in the timeline, you can start with the Dark Imperium trilogy. This goes from Dark Imperium to Plague War to Godblight, and it covers the Death Guard invasion of Ultramar, and this is actually one of the most recent series that's been produced, as in it's the furthest in the timeline that we've seen so far. The first book is just kind of okay, but the next 2 books are absolutely incredible and have a lot of really deep insights to the workings of the 40k universe. Not to mention a lot of mind-blowing, universe-changing reveals in the third one. It's one of those book series that may make a few references to other events you might not be familiar with, but you don't really need to know much about 40k to actually enjoy this series. You just need to know what a Space Marine is. Now, if you want to get into the good stuff, I recommend starting with the Horus Heresy. Now, as I mentioned previously, the Horus Heresy is very long. It's still being written, and at this point there's 60 books in it so far. And it actually functions like a prequel. You see, it takes place in the year 30k, 10,000 years before the events that we're used to seeing in this universe. And as a prequel, it sets up a lot of the major characters and events in the Warhammer storyline. It's also flat out some of the best writing in all of 40k literature. I think something like half of these books have actually ended up on the New York Times bestseller list. Now, a word of warning before getting into the Horus Heresy. The recommended reading order of the Horus Heresy is absolutely ridiculous. This is it on screen, and this is tracking pretty much every major arc within the Horus Heresy storyline. So what you're going to want to do is start with the very first book, Horus Rising. Now, the first 3 books of the series are basically a complete trilogy, so you're going to want to read that as well as False Gods and Galaxy in Flames. Now, if you're brand new to Warhammer and you've never heard of the Horus Heresy before, it basically refers to one of the most important events that's ever taken place in the entire timeline. The Horus Heresy was a massive civil war that saw half of the Space Marine legions fall to chaos and betray the Emperor and his Imperium. And at the time when this happened, humanity was at the height of their power. They were out conquering the galaxy and had all kinds of amazing technology. But after the Horus Heresy was ended, we basically entered a new dark age. And in the main timeline of 40k in the year 41,000, we still haven't recovered from it. And if you're somebody who's at least a little bit familiar with 40k, you'll know that the Primarchs are characters that are just kind of talked about in legend, with the exception of Guilliman, who's come back recently. They're these larger-than-life, demigod-like figures that are referred to constantly, but we never really see them or hear them. Well, in the Horus Heresy, they're main characters. I've been into Warhammer lore for 15 years, and I didn't start the Horus Heresy until, about like a year or so ago, and just hearing the Primarchs talk to each other was mind-blowing for me, let alone actually getting to read about them in battle. And these guys are absolutely ludicrous, and that's saying a lot talking about 40k. The next 2 books that were released were Fulgrim and Flight of the Eisenstein, and both of these kind of expand on the events of the first 3 books. Fulgrim takes place around the exact same time, but from a perspective of a different character, while Flight of the Eisenstein takes place immediately afterwards and sets up how the Imperium found out about Horus's betrayal. However, after these 5 books, the storyline of the Horus Heresy kind of splits off in a whole bunch of different directions. The books that were released right after this were actually an origin story for the Dark Angels Legion. Now, some people choose to read the books literally in the order that they were released, but you're going to have a lot of overlapping storylines. So that's when you would go back to that chart I showed you before and kind of pick the arcs that you actually care about. Now, for me personally, I read those first 5 books and I just did not care about the Dark Angels, I'm going to be honest. So I read the first Heretic, which actually comes technically before the first 5 books and is about Lorgar and basically the first Primarch to fall to chaos. So those are some books that I think are really good for newcomers, but now I'm going to talk about my personal favorite books. Like I mentioned before, I really enjoyed the Night Lord trilogy. It's super dark, it's super edgy, but I'm a really big horror movie fan, so I found myself right at home with those books. I also really like the Fabius Bile trilogy because I think he's a really interesting, underrated character. He's basically Chaos's mad scientist type person. And speaking of spooky stuff, I'm actually a really big fan of Warhammer's horror line. I'll say of the ones I've read, I really enjoyed the House of Night and Chain, which is basically a Warhammer haunted house story, and The Wicked and the Damned, which is 3 books in one. It's an anthology that combines them in a really unique way. I was listening to the audio version of it, and I legit had to pause it and take a break at one point because I was getting too worked up. There was one scene in particular that had me legit freaked out, and that's rare because I watch a lot of spooky stuff. Now I have one final book to recommend to you, and this is going to sound really weird, but just bear with me. It's the 9th edition core rulebook for Warhammer 40k. Now I know what you're saying. I have absolutely no interest in playing the Warhammer tabletop game. It's too expensive. I don't want to do it. Why would I buy the rulebook? Well, here's the thing. It's something like 300 to 400 pages, and more than half of it is just lore. It functions kind of like a textbook, so if you want something more in the style of like the Silmarillion from Lord of the Rings, that just gives you an overview of the entire universe and every faction, it's perfect for that. I honest to God think that anyone who is interested in Warhammer in any way, shape, or form should buy that book. You can probably get it for like $30 on eBay. It came in a lot of the starter sets, so there's a lot of used ones floating around out there. And it's absolutely full of lore on anything that you could want to know about in the 40k universe. There's a little bit of everything in there. And to complement this, I would also recommend picking up older, out-of-date codexes for armies that you're interested in. If you don't know what a codex is, every army in this game has its own rulebook in addition to the core rules, which is where all of your special abilities and unit profiles that are unique to that army come from. And like with the core rulebook, a good third of it is just lore specifically about that army. Don't buy the new ones. A new codex runs around $50, maybe $40 if you buy it off of Amazon, something like that, and that's too much money. So what you're going to do is you're going to go and buy one of the older codexes off eBay, something from 8th edition and back. Because if you really only care about the lore, then you don't need to pay full price for the book. And all of those books had the lore in it. The only thing that's really changed in the newer edition is all the rules have been updated. And to the gaming portion of the community, a codex is basically worthless as soon as it's been updated. So it goes from being a $50 book to a book that you can get for like $1.50. There you go. There's a whole lot of reading material to keep you covered for a while. Now let's talk about some video games. So Warhammer video games have a tendency to be either really good or really bad. And if you look it up on Steam, you're gonna find dozens of entries. So let's talk about the ones that are worth playing. So when it comes to the video games, they're kind of hit or miss. Games Workshop, the company that makes Warhammer, tends to take more of a shotgun approach when it comes to making their games. Now, what that means is instead of focusing on AAA developers just making 1 or 2 games every like 5 to 10 years and making them as good as absolute possible, they basically let anybody who wants to make a Warhammer game make a Warhammer game. So this has led to a lot of lower budget games, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some of these lower budget games have been really, really good. But if I'm being honest, it's also led to basically a whole bunch of shovelware. So right off the bat, I would say objectively, the fan favorite game in all of the 40k games would be the Dawn of War series, at least Dawn of War 1 and 2. These came out in the mid to late 2000s, so they're definitely showing their age at this point. But they have really punchy, really fun combat, and really good base building as well. And even to this day, more than a decade later, there is an incredibly dedicated team of people that are still making content for it. The modding community has added just an obscene amount of content to the original Dawn of War. I've watched videos of people playing apocalypse-sized battles with actual friggin' titans in it. So if you're someone who really likes games like StarCraft, I think you'll really enjoy the first Dawn of War. Now, it had multiple expansions, and one of them, the Dark Crusade, was its own standalone game. And I have to say, if you were going to get just one, get Dark Crusade. It had a really amazing campaign where part of it was basically like a board game and you were conquering different parts of the map. Also, let me just say the Orc campaign was absolutely hilarious. The general that you play as, his sole motivation was basically there was an Inquisitor who had a hat that he liked. And so his entire warband was doing everything they do in the campaign and going to war against thousands and thousands of different people on different factions because he really wanted that hat.
I like your hat, by the way.
So yeah, Dawn of War 1, wonderful game. Dark Crusade, if you're gonna get one of them, get that one. Again, definitely showing its age, but I still think it holds up. Now, the interesting thing about the Dawn of War series is each game has been completely different from the other ones. We don't talk about the third one. The third one was not great, so just avoid that at all costs. But the second one was actually really good, but people didn't really like it when it first came out. It plays very differently from the first game. You're not really focused on building a base and controlling an entire army. You're more focused on just a handful of people. So you go from controlling a whole army to just a squad, but each member of that squad is capable of a ton of different stuff. And it actually had some pretty interesting boss fight type moments in the campaign. Not to mention that there was a horde mode in that game that still people play religiously to this day. Now, one of my recent favorites has been a game called Space Hulk Deathwing. And this is a Left 4 Dead style game where up to 4 players play as Terminators on what is known as a Space Hulk, which is basically a derelict ship that's floating around in space and has just been flooded with Tyranids. And this game really captures what it's like to be a Terminator. Every step you take is big and heavy and clunky. The weapons have an enormous amount of punch to them. If I had one major criticism with this game is that its campaign mode was honestly pretty lackluster. The AI of your squad mates was not great, to say the least. So when I first played it, I didn't really like it, and then some of my friends convinced me to play, and once I was playing with other real people, that game took on a whole new life. So definitely worth checking out if you like first-person shooters and you like the Warhammer universe, or if you're a big fan of Left 4 Dead style games. Now, shifting back to tactics style games, if you're a fan of something like XCOM, you should check out Mechanicus. This was a budget indie game that, honest to God, I got on sale for $1 on a Steam sale. So I didn't really have a lot of high expectations for it, but oh my god was I blown away. You play as a group of tech priests, part of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who are infiltrating Necron tomb worlds to steal valuable artifacts. It's a grid-style turn-based strategy game, and you spend half of each mission exploring the tomb world before you eventually get into battle. And the goal of your squad is to get in, accomplish your objective, and get back out as quick as possible. But the more time you spend exploring, the more Necrons start turning online. So there's a really interesting risk-reward mechanic with its gameplay. And the further you go into the game, you start unlocking all these new upgrades, your squad mates level up, you unlock more powerful units. It's a wonderful game, and like I said, I got it for $1. Now, next is another older game. This one came out in 2011, I believe. It's Space Marine, and it originally came out on the Xbox 360. It's a hack and slash style game. You play as Captain Titus, one of the Ultramarines, and you basically just massacre hundreds of thousands of orcs. It actually had a really interesting multiplayer mode, but unfortunately, I believe those servers are offline now. The single player game still is fantastic. And Space Marine 2 just got announced like a month ago, so now's never been a better time to play it. Now, when we're talking about the TV shows, i.e. Warhammer Plus, I'm gonna do a video giving you my full review and whether or not I think it's worth it. But real quick, if you're just interested in the animations, I'd say buy a month and then just watch all the content that they have, and then you can unsubscribe after that. The animation they have is really, really good. I really enjoyed both of the shows they have. But the reality is it's not a lot of content. Now they have battle reports and they have a bunch of other stuff on there, but we can get that for free on YouTube. And from what I watched, they're good. Their painting tutorials are very well made. The battle reports are well made, but it's not really something that I personally would want to continue a subscription for. So buy a month, watch those animations, and then if you decide to cancel it after that, totally makes sense. So like I said in the beginning of this video, I've been obsessed with Warhammer for about 15 years. I absolutely adore the lore, I adore the tabletop game. I've probably played about 9 different armies at some point in the last 15 years, and I've read about 80-ish to 100 of the books. And my obsession with Warhammer, I really don't think it's gonna change anytime soon. So maybe through this video, you found your own entry point into this franchise, in this community. Whether that be through painting the miniatures, whether that be through playing the video games or getting into the tabletop, it doesn't matter. And again, Warhammer is a massive franchise, so I've probably missed a couple of things. So if you're a veteran or you've played before or you've been in the community for a minute, let me know down in the comments and talk to other people in there and let them know what ways you think are a really good way of getting into this community. Do you recommend buying the models? Do you recommend playing any of the video games? Is there a particular video game that's worth playing? What's your favorite book? I have not read all of the books, so there's probably some really good ones that I didn't cover in this video, so let me know which ones that you think I should personally read and what everybody else in the comments should as well. If you found this video informative, go ahead and drop a like, leave a comment down in the comment section, and subscribe for more Warhammer content. I'm going to be posting a lot of my shorts from TikTok over here as I migrate into YouTube, and I'm going to be trying to put out more of these videos. I still have to make a studio and all that kind of stuff, so it's going to be a wild journey. So thank y'all for hanging out with me, and I hope y'all have a great day. Happy wargaming.